Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you in the name of Vontobel to today's fireside chat with two experts. The whole world getting vaccinated against the coronavirus thanks to innovation and investments of various biotechnology companies. The last 2 to 3 years have certainly been the most eventful time for the entire biotechnology industry. But what's next? What are the latest trends, technologies and innovations? As an investor, what do you have to look in it when it comes to new investments into this industry? Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have repeatedly shared our expertise with you together with our analyst Stefan Schneider, who used to work as a molecular biologist in the past. Today, we have a listed company as our guest, which is excellent in the field of biotechnology, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome Daniel Koller. Daniel Koller is the head of the investment management team of Biotech and will give us and share his information about the industry. His interview partner is Stefan Schneider, our head of life sciences from our research department. If you have any questions would you like to have answered in the end of the live stream, please write it in the right hand side of your screen in the black box. Before I hand over to Stefan, let's start the fireside chat with a short video about Biotech.
We identify the most promising biotech companies and then construct a portfolio with a very attractive risk-return profile.
Biotechnology is a driver of innovation in medicine. We are particularly interested in novel technologies such as RNA and gene therapy.
Our portfolio consists of 20 to 35 stocks that have been carefully screened in a fundamentally driven process.
We maintain close contact to the top management of biotech companies, as well as physicians and researchers, to make sure that we have a holistic and well-founded view on the sector.
Our goal is to offer investors growth and dividend income in a single stock.
Hello, Daniel, also from my side. So for decades now I've been following the biotech industry. All along this time Biotech has been around, and I was always interested in your holdings, in your share price, and so it's a pleasure for me to have you here and ask you some questions. And to kick it off, I'd like to ask you, biotech, why is it so exciting? Why is it so important?
Hi Stefan, thanks for having me, and looking forward to today's discussion about the biotech industry and why we are so excited about it. I think your question to start off is spot on, because I think biotech is in its perfect sweet spot in terms of combining technology on one hand, with on the other hand obviously medical innovation that leads to ultimately to drugs or medicines that treat severe and often chronic conditions. And as we show on the slide, or we have a couple of slides here, as we show on one of the slides, you see, for example, the major causes or the leading causes of death, which actually the top spot still occupied by disease of heart, so cardiovascular disease, followed by cancer, and then later on or further down you see Alzheimer's or dementia. So we have some serious disorders, severe diseases that, as said, or often chronic diseases that require, I think, solutions. And I said the biotech industry, I think, is so exciting because I said it's the merger between, I said, new technologies. As you know, the industry started off with the small molecule and then the protein-based medicines. And over the last, I would say, 10 years, we have seen a super fast evolution in terms of RNA-based medicine, followed by cell-based therapies. Potentially, we can talk later on about other new technologies, like, for example, genetic medicine. So we think actually it's at the core. And if I may follow up with one of the next slides, I said, with the introduction we heard, I said we're in the pandemic. I think biotech industry is at the spotlight and could prove itself. And I think the Operation Warp Speed that we could obviously track almost on a real-time basis was, I think, a perfect example. And as you see, for example, on that slide, we have depicted here in very simplistic summaries, the evolution of the timelines in terms of a clinical development project in a typical vaccine project and what happened last year, I said, in 2020. And as you know, and have followed this as very well closely, everything could have been accelerated. And it was possible because of academia, science, both the regulatory authorities, but most important, I would say, from the industry in terms of these technologies offering access. And as you see, for example, on the next slide, we had 4 major classes then of vaccines. Quickly depicted here, I think the spotlight have clearly been taken by the messenger RNA vaccine. I said we had obviously the adeno-associated viruses, or the adenovector-based, better said, viruses that we had, live attenuated, and then I said the protein-based. And I said, luckily, from the speed of development and the versatility of the technology, I said the messenger RNA has clearly overtaken everything. And nowadays, with Pfizer, BioNTech, and our portfolio holding Moderna, obviously being a major role model here in terms of how quick and efficacious these new modalities are.
Yeah. So this is very, very interesting. So I guess the question couldn't be answered at a more appropriate time, with biotech just having shown what they're capable of last year and you just presented here what they're able of doing. And so you mentioned this mRNA technology. I think that's probably almost everybody has heard about it, but maybe you can give some more insight into that technology and also some of the companies that are behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I said we start to invest into the RNA-based medicine, and just quickly, RNA is obviously the translational or the messenger that brings information from the cell core that we have, all of us, into function that's then protein. And I said we study that technology for many, many years already, coming from the other side, actually from the blocking side. But just quickly, here we have another slide just describing more Moderna, not itself, the messenger RNA, but allow me then to share how this all works. So the messenger RNA, I said, is the function, or like a software, you can say. So Moderna has developed a messenger RNA with the function, for example, of the corona vaccine, with the spike protein that's packaged in a small lipid droplet, so a little fat droplet. And as many of you obviously know, nowadays you get this injected twice, day 0 or day 1, and then followed 30 days later. And what happens up on the injection is the messenger RNA is taken up by our cells. The spike protein of the virus produced, and we elicit a strong immune response. And I said that we have seen ultimately translated into obviously a situation that Moderna has leapfrogged through all the development cycles, from an earlier stage company into actually a company that has now a product that is sold in hundreds of millions of doses. And that's, as you can see here depicted, for example, on the share price as well, then a reflection of the acceleration and the success. And as I outlined already, we came from the other side, so from the blocking side. I talked about RNA-based medicine. Another slide, or a quick intro to Alnylam, for example, which I would say is one of the leaders clearly in that field. If our protein, or if you're a patient and our disease is driven by, for example, the production of a toxic protein, so too much of a protein that's existent, I think the Alnylam technology is here perfect in terms of dialing down, for example, the level of the presence of that toxic protein. And that company already has achieved 3 products, have come from the classical biotech side, focusing actually on so-called orphans, so rare disorders. And that company will expand then later on into bigger markets, ultimately into mass markets. And I think that's actually interesting that Moderna started the other way around. Although the focus was on smaller indications as well, they started obviously with the pandemic now in the very largest opportunity that ever existed.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite interesting in terms of an evolution.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So I guess you explained it very well, but I think just the power of this technology is everybody obvious, because we have vaccines around now, just months or a year into the pandemic. But as you explained, it can go much broader, and there is many more indications that could be treated with RNA technology.
Absolutely.
But what I'm currently getting is also interest into, yes, RNA, we're getting on top of it, stock prices have already moved and stuff. So I get a lot of interest. Is there anything else that could make headlines today, tomorrow, or in the future that the biotech industry is working on? Maybe you have some more insights here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I said, we showcase this as well, that we start to evolve more and more into these new technologies, because I think it's a combination of these technologies becoming applicable. I think that's most important. So it's not just science in the lab, but you can translate, as I said, these technologies into functional products that help then patients ultimately and to solve the disease, for example. And one of the areas we focus as well, I would say already 2-3 years ago, but that technology, for example, has taken a major spotlight, if I can mention one, in the genetic medicines field. It's actually the gene editing technologies. And gene editing means nothing else. It's like a scissor, so you can actually go and correct or alter the genetic makeup, for example, of the patient cell. And one company that's there leading, or the technology that we describe here quickly in terms of what it actually encumbers. So to try to explain it quickly, because I said it's quite technological complex, but ultimately it's nothing else than an enzyme, so a protein that can actually translate the function. And it requires a so-called guide RNA, or something that will tell exactly where in the genome that enzyme shall actually do its job. And it can do a multitude. In general, it just cuts, and then, with clever tricking of it, you can either have a destruction of a genetic function, you can have a deletion, you can have an insertion or a correction. But the first steps that we have nowadays with companies like, for example, CRISPR Therapeutics, which we think is leading there, is, for example, in the severe hematological disorders like sickle cell or beta thal. That's 2 big indications, for example, where patients have actually a dysfunctional blood system. So their red blood cells that we all know have to transport oxygen are actually not functioning well. And CRISPR has here deployed actually, I would say, quite a neat approach. It still requires quite a severe approach, in a sense that it's ultimately like a bone marrow transplant, but leads in these severe indication actually curative intent, meaning a one-time treatment, it looks like for now, ultimately resolves the disease for the rest of the life. And I think that obviously is extremely valuable. And the key or core for these technologies, once again, will be how can you move out of this ultra-orphan or rare disorders into more common diseases, and ultimately into broader markets as such. So very intriguing technology, still in its early days. And you just mentioned share prices. We see there as well more volatility, so that's why Dennis said we, nevertheless, as excited as we are, we rather carefully, get exposure into that field, and we balance this out in a portfolio. But I would say genetic medicine is clearly something that everybody shall watch out for.
Yeah. No, I'm always fascinated what biotech brings to the table these days in terms of generating new medicines, and what seems to be not curable starts to be in reach. And so that's interesting. Thanks for all your insights. I could go on for hours and talk through all the new technologies that are emerging, but maybe just you mentioned it, portfolio. So I think I'm curious to understand a bit better.
Yeah.
How do you think about portfolio? How do you integrate this? And you talked about volatility portfolio. How do you bring it all together?
I think that's ultimately crucial as well. So I said, as excited as we are about these technologies, I said we study them in detail, and we think there's no other way around than doing fundamental analysis, both in terms of technology, but as well in terms of opportunity. That's important as well. So just the most interesting technology that cannot be translated into functional product that ultimately as well is beneficial for a patient and can be even paid for, this has all to come together. And I think that's what we dare to do with the team. And we have here a quick depiction rather of, I would say, a simplified chart in terms of how the evolution of all these new technologies, or I call them startup or early companies, is. So you see here, for example, in that chart at the bottom left, the early venture capitalized companies that have the project that start off, and at the top right, big pharma that has had the evolution through many of these steps, but isn't growing that fast anymore. And we see the sweet spot of ours actually where companies move into clinical trials and then prove that, I said, the value is there for, I said, the patient and healthcare system. And that's what we balance. So we start off doing smaller allocation in high risk, smaller companies. And we let these companies, because we have a long-term investment horizon, and that's our goal as well, to achieve, I said, a 15% compounded return per annum. That we think is only possible if you have successful companies that walk from the lower part to the upper part, and we have the long-term view on these, as well as the concentration approach, meaning whenever companies move up, as you will see with a Moderna, for example, in our case, it started off smaller, is today our largest portfolio holding, but said due to its success, it grew, and we continue to retain it as such. And the next step is what I started off a bit at the very beginning, the disease area. So we structure as well in terms of the different disease areas, the different technology areas, and the different evolutions of these companies. And just from a top-down view, I would say see on the left-hand side on that slide, the indications that we have there. I said orphan, cancer, and the central nervous system disorders make up around 3/4. That's what we think are disease areas with big innovation leaps and steps. And I think 5 and 10 year horizon where we see a huge demand from the patient side. In the middle, it's then the different modalities that I touched on. It's still small molecule, actually an important play, but I think the other areas are gaining share, so to speak, in our portfolio due to their success. And on the right-hand side, you get a feel as well that our major exposure actually is into the mid or the larger mid cap all the way down to the smaller cap, where I said we have the new investment ideas as such. So I think it's very important how you structure a portfolio, and that said you keep a good risk return or an overall good risk return characteristics as such.
Yeah. No, it seems to be very structured approach, and you mentioned it, risk return. So I guess everybody also from the participants of this live stream is interested in returns. So you've been around a long time, so how does that look? Can you achieve returns that are interesting?
Yeah, I said with the S-curve chart, our goal, as said, intended is 15% compounded return. And if I may do a bit of self-marketing here, I think the long-term chart always speaks kind of like for itself, but it shows you both sides. So we are very close to this 15%, high 14% since inception, so almost 28 years now that we have this track record. You see as well that with an active portfolio approach, that I think is differentiated from just the average that's more geared towards the established and larger cap companies as such. That's what you see in gray, for example, here the benchmark. So you can achieve this. But it comes said with the volatility price on the other hand. So I think as a biotech investor, on a forward basis, I'm actually, if I may say so, even more optimistic, given said all the innovation that's going on, all the translation into real world, the capital markets are there to obviously sustain this growth, but volatility is another factor not to be forgotten. But I said ultimately in the mid and longer term, for example, if you see the broader markets like an SPI, for example, in Switzerland, you achieve less than half, sometimes even only a third, even in the long term. So I think biotech is really an attractive place to have an asset allocation into.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So maybe not for everyone, but still, if you're a long-term investor with a clear horizon to be invested, it seems to be great. So I guess for those that are interested, they would like to know a bit more background maybe on who is BB Biotech and what do you exactly do aside just the investments that we did? So maybe you can help us here a bit further.
Okay, absolutely happy to do so. So I said BB Biotech, so we have, I think, 2 slides on this. Let me start with this one here that you see is kind of like the fact sheet in terms of, or the simple facts that I think summarize BB Biotech quite well. So we're an investment company since inception, so 1993. We have multiple listings, but I think the key listing here is in Switzerland. That has triggered as well that we are now in larger benchmarks, like, for example, the SMIM, so the top 50 of Switzerland, or the SPI. And as you see on the right-hand side, a couple of facts in terms of liquidity. So we are a share traded on the stock market, quite easy accessible. But I said the goal for us is to drive these returns by obviously doing investments into the sector by this concentrated portfolio approach. And that's done by a team of, I would say, a very highly renowned, high-profile board of directors. So we have 5 of them. Then a portfolio management team, and we are obviously supported by a lot of other colleagues of ours who help us to drive this performance over the year. And just to close it out, I would say one thing that we are always attracted to, I said, is growth. So we're clearly a growth investor, and I think that chart here depicts that at its center. That's actually our ownership in companies that, as I said, drive over proportional growth for the BB Biotech shareholders by us obviously being invested into different companies. And you see here on the left-hand side, the multiple years of product launches drive quite over proportional revenue growth. So for example, the biotech industry does plus minus 10% per year in terms of revenue growth. The pharma is between half, I would say rather a third of that. And we clearly are substantially higher than this. And that doesn't even yet include, for example, the corona revenues, which we have not yet modeled out. Because on the right-hand side, you see then the different, for example, indications again, the different diseases that play an important role. And here you'd see, for example, infectious disease pretty much missing. So in the next update we're going to do, you will see as well, I would say, the substantial bump up that obviously happened by Moderna now. I said, coming from 0 revenues in a year and doing probably close to 20 billion in revenues just in 2021. That's obviously an extreme, but it shows you the dynamics and the upside that we get from this. And I think that's at the core of what BB Biotech does. Identify attractive clinical assets, invest in them, hold on to them to participate in this overproportional growth.
Okay. So thank you very much. I think that was to the point, clear and sharp. And in the sake of time, I'd like to give also our audience the opportunity to ask some questions if they're available. But thank you.
Thanks, Stefan.
So many thanks to Daniel and Stefan for your really exciting insights of the industry. And let me check if we have any questions. There are a few of them. Let's start with the first one. Any insight about Celsion?
Insight into? I didn't hear the
Celsion?
question. Celsion?
Yeah.
Not really. So I said I'm not into all the individual companies per se. So I said we look obviously at the sector rather, or at least global, but ultimately I said we focus mostly on our companies. I would shy away a bit in terms of giving indication on individual other stocks. So that's a policy we have in general. It's not that we don't want to avoid commenting about companies. But I said in general, we don't comment too much about non-portfolio companies. So we prefer to speak about, what's in the portfolio. So my apologies on that front.
Good. Then another one is, there was a lot of noise about AstraZeneca. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the Astra news, that, if you want to say so, I think that was actually the negative in terms of, all the speed and acceleration. Because many things happen at the same time there. And the main problem for Astra, at least for a while, was, I said, they had split data, different updates. And the ultimate focus now obviously was on the side effect, or the very rare side effect of the deep vein thrombosis that we have seen, so even in the brain, and then ultimately leading even to bleeds in the brain. So we have seen there a higher rate than usual. And I think that's exactly the problem nowadays for all the other technologies, because so far what we have seen from the messenger RNA, they clearly had this much less to pretty much background rates, if at all. And from that perspective now, with different options in the market, I think there's a clear preference towards the messenger RNA. If you think of the world excluding messenger RNA or countries that have no access, I think all the vaccines offer actually a good risk benefit profile as such. But if I have the choice, and I said, for example, here in Switzerland, we have the exclusive situation for now at least to just get the messenger RNA vaccine. I think we are quite lucky to have that option over the others, if at least you have a choice.
Thanks for that. Then what is the roadmap for the treatment of neuro illnesses like MS?
Yeah, multiple sclerosis is I said, one of the topics we have been invested actually in the longer past. If I can do a quick bracket here, in Biogen IDEC, for example, was one, Receptos was one, with the S1P. So we have many modalities that mainly target actually the immune system, because I said it's almost like an inflammatory disease. Nowadays you have new approaches that try, I said, can you avoid the demyelation or ultimately as well the remyelation, meaning can you correct it back? But I said the treatment options that we have for now, and unfortunately patients continue to progress often and cycle through all of them. Start off with the interferons that we have now for 20 years, then I said go on many of the oral options as of today. So we think, there it's unfortunately chronic disease where the drug so far had a clear benefit and a clear slowing of the progression. But the ultimate goal there, for example, to slow or completely stall the disease or even revert it, we're not there yet. So I think there's plenty of room to further invest and innovate in even the multiple sclerosis space. But currently we have little to no exposure. We bought back into Biogen, just to declare that, late last year. But this actually was more towards, I would say, strategic investment around the whole topic of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, where we soon, in the next couple of weeks, will get an important FDA decision, which is a high-risk decision, so to speak. But if positive, I think it will propel the whole space to invest further and more aggressively into Alzheimer's and dementia.
Great. Then another one. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about BB Biotech and especially the team behind it?
Yeah, I think in many of these cases, I said we're an investment company. So at the core is what do we do? What is our strategy? What are the investment guidelines? But ultimately, it's the team together with the board that ultimately generates the portfolio, and as I said, takes hopefully the right decision and the right investment decisions. So one is what are the strategic decisions, what are structural decision, all the way I said down to portfolio question. And that can go all over. So for example, I said we have a board of directors of 5. If I can quickly highlight or mention them. So we're led by our chairman, Dr. Eric Hunziker, which I think is very well known for his last public role when he was CFO of the Roche Group for many, many years. We have Clive Meanwell, who is for over 15 years now on the board. He made, I would say, a more important splash, so to say, in the markets when Novartis bought out the medicines company not too long ago. Then we have Thomas von Planta, who supports us. He's a Swiss citizen and supports us here locally, as well as 2 new members coming from the industry side. Once again, one is Dr. Susan Galbraith. She heads up the oncology side or the research and development efforts in early oncology at AstraZeneca, so one of our core area, if you want to say so. And the last that I would like to highlight here is Mats Thompson from Novo Nordisk. Nowadays changed to actually the Novo Foundation. So he was for decades actually at Novo Nordisk and pretty much behind a lot of successes that they had there in the metabolic field, better known, for example, for Novo Nordisk, obviously in diabetes. And then on the team side, we're now a team of 7 portfolio managers, 3 of them actually working in the East Coast, so close to where many of our investments are. And then we have 4 here. We are split in the team between different functionalities. So pretty much all of us have a scientific background with one exception, but that's Felicia, who covers the sector for 20 plus years already. And I think we have, I would say, a team that adds up quite well in terms of disease areas. That's the coverage as well. And then trying to break this down into, I said, what our goal is obviously a functional portfolio that succeeds for our shareholders.
Perfect. Then we come to the last question. Do you think big pharma, as Roche or Novartis, could perform better in the near future compared to biotech?
Yeah, the near future is always, I would say, a tough call to make, because the near future is often more influenced by what's going on politically, what are, for example, valuation differences, etc. I think I would rather focus on the mid and longer term. And there I see actually, in general, that's not against these two companies, but I just see in general that if you invest into the next generation companies with a set of attractive technologies that they own, I think you will outperform, or you should outperform actually almost by default, given the different growth trajectory and the opportunities. But you obviously have to count as well for volatility and some failures in that. So short term, I would not dare to give here, or I don't have the crystal ball, but mid and long term, we feel quite comfortable. And we think, as you heard, our guides with 15% compounded return on investment that we want to achieve. I think a large corporation that's multi-hundred billion market cap with high double-digit billions of revenues, it's very difficult for these companies to even keep up at that level in terms of growth and opportunities. And from that perspective, I prefer the biotech sector, and even more so our portfolio.
Cool. So then we are at the end of the live stream. I would like to thank you for your questions and participation, and we wish you a very sunny summertime, and stay healthy. Thank you.